Okay, this is going to be your review for your midterm. It is 50 questions long, covers 3 sections, or 3 chapters, I should say, 4 sections. Should be a review of trauma, should be bleeding control and shock management, soft tissue injuries, and it should also include burns. So with that being said, I'm going to get started. Alright, so know the definition of what high index of suspicion means? High index of suspicion. Know the 2 most common mechanisms of injuries for blunt trauma. Know what it means to you as far as a safety concern if you run a motor vehicle collision and the airbags do not deploy. Know what is entailed when a bullet enters and exits the body. Let's see. No signs and symptoms for a spinal cord injury, intracranial bleeding, and a fracture to the skull. Spinal cord injury, intracranial bleeding, and a fracture to the skull. Okay. Know your cardiac vasculature system, from the aorta all the way down and through and back to the vena cava. You need to know your vascular system. Know the definition of hypoperfusion. Hypoperfusion. Know signs and symptoms for an aortic aneurysm, gastrointestinal bleeding, and intrathoracic hemorrhage. That's aortic aneurysm, gastrointestinal bleeding, and intrathoracic hemorrhage. No signs and symptoms of GI bleeding. You want to know what hematemesis means. Hemoptysis, that's Hemoptysis. Hematuria, Hematuria. And dyspnea means Dyspnea. Know your abdominal anatomy and know it well. Pay particular attention to the location of what quadrant or what area of the abdomen they're in. Know early indications for internal bleeding, non-traumatic internal bleeding, signs and symptoms, especially when it's being compensated or tolerated well. Let's see, still looking. Know your bleeding control and shock management. Know your bleeding control and shock management. Know also the difference between a pressure dressing and a sterile dressing. Know what to do if the pressure dressing or the sterile dressing is bleeding, and if it's either a fast bleed or a slow bleed, what you do, what your next steps are. They are different. Know how to treat an epistaxis. Epistaxis. And know what that word means. Know your layers of skin. Know your layers of skin. Also how they relate to burns. And so you need to know the names or the types of burns, the names and the number of degree they're associated with. For example, 1st degree through 3rd degree. You need to know how, and their actual terms, their medical terms as far as thickness and what areas of the skin. You also need to know the anatomy of the skin, the layers of the skin, and which layer does what. You need to know the anatomical and physiologic function of the skin. Also, I know we haven't had environmental emergencies, but know what happens when you are exposed to cold, what your body does. Know what ecchymosis means. ECCHYMOSIS. Know the signs and symptoms of compartment syndrome. Compartment syndrome. Also know amputation versus partial amputation. How you treat those. What you're looking to do if those happen. Know the difference between what an avulsion is, an abrasion, incision, and laceration. Avulsion, abrasion, incision, and laceration. Know the difference between what type of wounds you will have with handgun, shotgun, 22 cal, and a 357 Magnum. Know the severity of that. Still looking. Know what to do if you have an open chest wound, especially one that's going to compromise the lungs and cause a pneumothorax or a tension pneumothorax. Know what an evisceration is. EVISCERATION. Evisceration. Also, know how to treat an evisceration. Know what you do. Know how to treat and care for a person with an impaled object. An impaled object. And also know the difference between the location of the impaled object. If your treatment will depend on where it is located and what you do with it. If you have an open neck injury, you want to know what you are concerned with. You need to tell me or know what your concern is if you are to have an open neck injury. Airway burns. Know what you're worried about and know what your signs and symptoms are for an airway burn. Rule of nines. You need to know the rule of nines for adult and pediatric and the differences between the adult and the pediatric. Also, you need to know how to treat a patient that is covered with dry chem. If they're covered with a dry chemical, how do you care for them? Also know how to treat thermal burns versus electrical burns, and know the differences between the two if they were to occur. And that's it.